I don't think I've met a circle skirt that I didn't like. Maybe the quarter circle skirt is not my best friend, but still, yeah, it's one that I will make and wear every now and again. Now, if you want extra drama and you have enough fabric, then the double circle skirt might be one that you want to give a try. And this is how I tackled that project. Okay, so to draft your circle skirt, your double circle skirt, you're going to need a few measurements. The first one is going to be your actual waist measurement. So for me, that's 26 inches. Personally, I like an inch of ease on my skirts, so that gives me a waist measurement of 27 inches. There are two ways of doing a circle skirt. You can either draft a regular circle skirt at a 27-inch waist, cut it out twice and gather in the excess fabric, so you're basically ending up with a waist that will be double this. So gather that down to 27 inches and sew that onto your waistband or your bodice. That way you will have double the amount of fabric in your skirt. That's a really good option if you have a very lightweight fabric like a viscose. It could end up being bulky around the waist, so it is something to consider. I decided to go down the route of dividing my waist measurement in half, which gives me a waist of 13.5 inches. So that 13.5 inches I then use in a circle skirt calculator or a circle calculator. I use the Omni one, which I will link down below, and that will give me a radius of 1.36. Okay, so we are aiming for a double circle skirt, so that means we need 2 circles to fit onto our waist, which is why we divided our waist in half. So I've drawn these ones out so you can kind of get an idea of how it's going to go together. So our first circle, our centre front won't have a seam down it because I just prefer that look. The circumference of this inner circle is 13.5 inches, which is half of the waist that we're working with. That means that this back, what would be a back seam on a regular circle skirt, is our side seam. So then we have our second circle with the circumference of 13.5. 2 of those together equals 27. And so the centre front seam on this one is actually our side seam, and then this is our centre back seam. So ideally we're going to be turning this into this. So there's going to be 8 panels in each side of our skirt. So obviously our first panel number 1 is going to get cut on the fold, and then we've got panels 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 and 8. So we need to turn this into a pattern. I personally like to draft from a quarter of a circle skirt when I'm making circle skirt patterns, but in this case I actually drew out a full half circle. I am working at scale just because obviously these pattern pieces are huge in real life, so I hope you can get kind of like an idea of what I'm talking about. So we've got the radius here of 1.36 inches, and then this again measures around 13 or half of 13.5 inches. So this is 1/2 of one of our circles. I want my front panel to be cut on the fold. The way that I determine how wide that panel is going to be is by taking my fabric, and again I'm doing this at scale. So I have just folded this piece of fabric in half. Let's pretend this is 140 centimeters wide. Folded it in half, which means that this measurement will be 70 centimeters. Just to give myself a little bit of wiggle room, I'm actually going to make my skirt panels 68 centimeters wide. And so I'm going to take that information over to my pattern piece, take my ruler and put the ruler on the centre front fold here, mark over so that it's at 68 centimeters wide, make a mark, and then draw a line from that mark up to the center point where we marked our radius from, and that is pattern piece number 1. So I'm going to label that, and we are cutting that on the fold. So I'm going to mark that in. Can't draw straight. So that's pattern piece number 1. Now we're going to do the same thing for the next one. We're going to mark across, make sure that the bottom of the fabric isn't going to be any wider, that the bottom of the pattern piece, sorry, isn't going to be any wider than the fabric. I'm going to draw in that line there and repeat. So we're going to do the same thing, make sure that the bottom of the fabric isn't going to be any wider, bottom of the pattern piece isn't going to be any wider than the fabric, and draw in that line. So we've got pattern pieces 2, 3 and 4. So we've just drafted a quarter of our circle skirt. Now you can totally cut this apart, add seam allowance to it, and then draft some other pattern pieces afterwards, but I like to keep this as my master pattern. So what I'll do is take some tracing paper and I'll actually put that over and then trace out my new pattern pieces. And I'm doing that because I need to add seam allowance. Anytime you add a style line, you need to add seam allowance in. If I cut this apart, I then have to stick a lot of seam allowance on. These are large pattern pieces when you're doing it at full scale. I always iron my pattern pieces before I use them if they've been stored up and folded in one of my pattern folders. So I don't like there to be too much tape on my pieces because I find that it can get gunky and you can destroy the iron, and it doesn't want to iron flat, and sometimes the tape can contract. So personally, I like to trace my pattern pieces and have as little tape on them as possible. So I'm going to trace this pattern piece out by, and this is a little bit difficult to do because this is not tracing paper, but there's the center front, there's the hem. I've gone for a 28-inch long skirt because I use a 1/4 inch hem because I hem with bias binding. And there is the edge of pattern piece number 1 as marked. So now we need to add in our markings, and I am going to put in that this is pattern piece 1. It's going to get cut on the fold, which is what that indicates. Then we need to add seam allowance. So I need to add seam allowance to this side of the pattern and also the waistline. Now I use 5/8 of an inch seam allowance because I like to French seam my pieces together. 5/8 of an inch is a really good amount for that. You can use any amount of seam allowance that you like and your finishing method that you prefer for your skirt. The other thing that I'm going to do is actually put in a notch up at the top here, and I'm going to label that notch number 1, and I want to bring that over and mark that on this pattern piece as well. And again, I am going to label that notch number 1. So it's number 1 on both pattern piece 1 and 2. So I'm going to repeat that all the way around so that I end up with all of my pattern pieces traced out with seam allowance added. So I have got pattern pieces 1 to cut on the fold, 2, 3 and 4 with all of the seam allowances all the way around. So I've added it at the waistline and also at the side seams. I've also marked on my notches and I have numbered my notches, and that's going to be important later. So as I think you can see, we have drafted pattern pieces 1, 2, 3 and 4. So we've drafted a quarter of our double circle skirt. So this is another reason that I want to use this as a master template, because I can now go back and draft pieces number 5, 6, 7 and 8. I am going to actually make this piece number 5. This will be piece number 6. This will be number 7. And this will be number 8. Now, you only need to retrace piece number 5. You can totally retrace every single piece, so you have 8 pattern pieces for your skirt if you want, but pieces 2, 3 and 4 can double up as pieces 6, 7 and 8. You just need to remember that you've got to cut 4 of these pieces. We're cutting 1 of piece 1 on the fold, and the cutting guide is listed in the description down below. We're going to cut 1 on fold, going to cut 4 of this one, cut 4 of this one and cut 4 of this one. And the trick for this is you cut out your mirrored image pieces. For pieces 2, 3 and 4, you take the pattern piece off, you put a numbered label on your piece. I like to also mark my notches with coloured pins. I'll put the notches in, but then I'll put a coloured pin next to the notch so I can find it in the print on the fabric. The piece that we will need to redraft is pattern piece number 5. And the reason that we need to redraft pattern piece number 5 is because we don't want to cut this on the fold. We want to cut this with seam allowance on both sides. So I'm going to trace out the original pattern piece and add the seam allowance on all sides. So this is pattern piece number 5 and we're going to cut 2. So the next thing we need to do is add a few more notches in, and this is going to help us to make sure that the skirt goes together slightly easier, as it were. Piece number 4 is going to get sewn to piece number 5, so I need to match up the notch, which is there, and I'm going to label that notch number 4. The next thing I'm going to do is do double notches. So we're going to have a double notch here, and we're going to label that 5. We're going to have a double notch in the middle, and that's going to be 6, and then a double notch at the top, which is going to be 7. So we need to go through and add in those double notches. Okay, so we've done with our master template for now, so that can go to the side. And these are the pattern pieces that you should end up with. So we've got piece number 1, one of those cut on the fold with a notch at the top. Piece number 2, cut 2 of those with notch number 1 and number 2. You then want to take that pattern piece off, label it number 2, and then cut another set, so another 2, so 4 in total. And that one you're going to put on notches 5 and 6, and you're going to label it or leave the pattern piece on and circle the 6. Then we've got pattern piece number 3, which you're going to cut 2 of, put in notch 2 and 3, take the pattern piece off, label it, put it to the side, use pattern piece 3/7, and you're going to be cutting another 2, and you're going to put on notches 6 and 7. You're going to circle on the pattern that it's number 7 and leave that to the side. Then you've got pattern piece number 4, so you're going to cut 2 of those and mark notch 3 and 4. Take the pattern piece off, you're going to put that to the side with a label on it. I like to put in coloured pins by my notches so that I can easily identify them. I'll talk to you about that in a little bit. So once you've taken that to the side, you're then going to use the pattern piece again to cut pattern pieces 8. So you're going to cut 2 of those, and you're going to mark in notch number 7 on that and put that to the side. And then you're going to come and do pattern piece number 5. You're going to cut 2 of those, mark in notch number 4 and notch number 5, because we need to match piece 5 up with piece 6, which is why you've got notch number 5 there. The only other thing you want to think about is your grain line. I personally like to run my grain line through the center of my pattern pieces like this, so that the center of the bottom of the curve is on the straight of grain. So that is going to be the grain line for all of my pattern pieces. Again, if you're going to find it easier, you can totally make 8 pattern pieces for this pattern if you find that will work for your brain and your kind of sewing process better than doubling up these pieces here. Cut guide is in the description down below. But we've now ended up, we've drafted 5, 6, 7 and 8, and obviously when we mirror those we will then end up with a double circle skirt, so 2 circles into one with a waist that will fit us, and then we can add that waist onto any bodice or waistband to finish off the skirt or the dress. Hopefully that makes sense. So once you've got your pattern worked out and you have numbered all of your pieces, you've notched all of your pieces, another way that I like to try and keep track of the pieces that I'm trying to sew is colour coordinating my pins. These are quilting pins. I know lots of you get upset with me for using quilting pins on fabrics. If it's a really fine fabric, I do have silk pins, and you can label your pattern pieces, which is another thing that I highly recommend you do. For me, I have a colour coding system, so green means it's the center front or the front pieces of my skirt, so I will put that in on the center front seam if there is one, or into the front skirt pattern piece. Yellow means it is the side seam, and so I will mark the side seams, especially even if I notch something. I tend to put the yellow pin in by the notch of the side seam piece so that I can see that this, when I pick it up, the yellow is definitely the side seam. And then the orange pins for me are the center back or a stopping point pin, so again I will put these in at the center back seam, especially if I've taken the pattern piece off, so that I definitely know when I pick that piece up that that is the center back seam, just so that I don't get any pieces mixed up or muddled, because there are a lot of seams in this skirt. As I mentioned, I will put labels on to my pattern pieces, especially as some of these pattern pieces need to be cut out twice. Personally, I like to take the fabric completely off of the pattern piece when I need to cut another set of them. I used to keep the fabric on, but I find it harder to make sure that I'm being completely on grain and then not distorting the fabric that I've already cut. So I like to unpin the pattern piece from the cut piece of fabric and label it. As you saw in the diagram of the drafting of this skirt pattern, I have numbered each of my pattern pieces 1 to 8, and obviously I need to cut out mirror images of all of these as well, so that I have a full full double circle skirt. As soon as I have cut it out and put the notches in, the correct notch for the correct numbered piece, I will also put on a label that shows which number that piece is so that I don't get confused when I'm sewing. So my next tip or trick is to put your pattern pieces in order that you're going to sew them, and I like to sew from the center front out. Personally, I like to pin both pieces to the center front before I sew, because, ask me how I know, sometimes it is very easy, even with all the notches and the labeling, to sew the second piece rather than to the other side of the center front to the piece that you've sewn on. So I like to pin both pieces, double check my work, make sure that I've got everything lined up where it should before I start sewing. I just repeat that as I go around, making sure that I'm picking up the correct numbered piece and attaching it to the correct seam. It's very easy for things to get pinned to the wrong place. Again, ask me how I know, I've done it before. So I do try and be as careful when I'm pinning things together to make sure that A, I'm matching up the wrong sides together because I French seam everything, and B, to make sure that I'm matching up the right seam to the right seam, so I'm sewing mirror images, not attaching the wrong piece on the wrong side, as it were. I also like to do the first pass of my French seams so that the entire thing is sewn into the circle skirt that it's going to be. I will then go and trim all of the seams, a lot of French seam spaghetti, press all of the seams, and then sew the second pass to finish off the French seam all in one go. Personally, I like to do as many processes at my station as I can, so sitting down and pinning, and then sewing, and then cutting, and then pressing, and then sewing again, and then pressing, rather than do one set of French seams in entirety, so you're getting up and going backwards and forwards to the ironing board. Again, it's just my personal preference. I like to do as much as I can in one position before I have to get up and move. It just makes sense to me that way. I know not everybody sews that way, but it is my preference. Once I've got all the pieces French seamed together, I then used bias binding on the centre back seam to finish off that seam. You can French seam under a zip. It's not my favourite. It's fiddly. You still have to finish the seam either side of the zip above where the zip finishes, because you can only French seam up to the bottom of the zip, and then you still have to finish the raw edges of the fabric that goes behind the zip, as it were. So personally, bias binding is my favourite. I used a poly satin bias binding for this. I've also used it to hem the skirt, although I played bias binding roulette and lost by about 1 metre, so I'm waiting for the rest of it to turn up so I can finish the hem of this skirt. But before you put on the bias binding to the hem, you want to make sure that you put this thing up to hang. I attached it to my bodice, and then I filmed the 12 for the lookbook because I knew I was going to let this skirt hang for quite a while to make sure that all of the bias was doing all of its biasy thing. I have then levelled the hem, and I have a video for different methods of doing it up here. Bias binding is my preferred way of finishing a circle skirt because I find it the quickest and the neatest. Even if you're hand sewing it, you can machine sew it, but I do prefer to finish it by hand because you are turning up a larger circumference into a smaller circumference. If you're turning it and turning it again, it's very easy for that hem to pucker. The only way around it is to do a really narrow rolled hem, which is totally fine, but it is a lot of work, especially on something this size. So I have gone the bias binding route, and again, I have a video about that up here if you would like to check that out in more detail. I absolutely love how this double circle skirt has come out. I think it is amazing. I think that the method that I went down, where I doubled my or halved my waist measurement and then just cut twice as much fabric so that it ended up as my actual waist measurement, was slightly more fabric economical than if I had gone down just the regular waist measurement, cut it out twice and then gather it in. Also, it's a much sleeker finish around the waist, especially on a dress like this. I would have gotten away with it with this fabric because it is a very lightweight viscose that could have taken all those extra gathers, but I am glad that I went down this route, although I do want to try the doubled waist measurement gathered down to fit. Again, I think another reason that it's worked so well is that this is such a super lightweight fabric, so whilst there's a giant amount of floof in the skirt, it is still under 5 meters of fabric in this dress. Because it's so lightweight, it floats and moves beautifully. It also looks great over the petticoat. I think if this had been a stiffer weight fabric, it would have been an even floofier skirt, which I'm not ruling out trying in the future because I have some cotton lawns that I can imagine would look great with a double circle skirt on them, but it will be interesting to see what the end result turns out like with a stiffer fabric over this very floaty viscose. This is the second double circle skirt that I've done. It's not going to be the last. As I say, I want to try it in different fabric weights. I think it's going to be really interesting to try it in a heavier weight one and see how floofy that ends up. It's a really fun skirt type to wear, and I'm so pleased I had enough of this gorgeous rose print viscose to give it a try. What do you guys think? And if you do decide to give this double circle skirt tutorial a try, please do use the hashtag ShawnMadeMeDoIt here and on Instagram, because I would love to see what yours turns out like. If you enjoyed this video, you might want to check out this tutorial here.